Many of us use ATMs. They're considered to be a relatively safe way to withdraw money from the bank. The bank has auditors that verify the transaction. I get a receipt, and I can check my bank statement to make sure that it was accurately recorded. Now, some of the same companies that make ATMs also make electronic voting machines, but it is almost impossible for the voter to verify that their vote was accurately recorded.
Here in Wisconsin, there are two voting machine companies. One of the leading vendors of electronic voting machines is a company called Command Central, a two-person company operating out of a strip mall in Minnesota, the same strip mall where Michelle Bachmann, a GOP senator, has her headquarters. The other is ES&S, that was part of a conglomeration that included the infamous Diebold company. Now, here in Wisconsin, we didn't use electronic voting machines except as a handicapped accessible option. Most polling places had paper ballots that were put through a counter. In event of a question of the accuracy of the vote or a recount, the paper ballots could be tallied. The electronic voting machines, called DRE touchscreen machines, are strictly digital and oftentimes have no paper backup. Your vote goes into a black box with no way for you to tell whether your choices were correctly recorded. Just as bad, there is no independent auditable trail for post-election recount. There have been many incidences of hacking, corrupted memory cards, and machine failures. Even a time in Washington, D.C. when the machines were hacked to elect a robot from the cartoon show Futurama to the school board. Yeah, really. Many countries have refused to use the DRE machines, most recently Ireland. The Irish Times reported in June of this year that Ireland was scrapping its e-voting machine, not selling them, but sending them to the scrap heap, due to issues with reliability of the vote count and the expense associated with this voting system. Now back to Wisconsin. In the June recall election this year, 46 Wisconsin counties used 3,000 voting machines for the first time. Just prior to the gubernatorial recall election on June 5th of 2012, Command Central gave hundreds of DRE machines in a deal to smaller municipalities where they gave 2 DREs for each optical scan machine that the municipality traded in. This deal was made at a meeting presided over by Kathy Nicholas, the Waukesha County Clerk, who became infamous because 2 days after the Wisconsin Supreme Court election won by Joanne Kloppenburg, this clerk found 1,700 votes for Kloppenburg's opponent, David Prosser, that gave the election to him. The results of the June recall election raised a lot of eyebrows, too. According to Bob Fitrinkas, who is an election law attorney and professor who has written 4 books on election integrity, the recall vote in Wisconsin produced another significant 7% discrepancy between the adjusted exit poll and the so-called recorded vote. In actual social science, he continued, this level of discrepancy, with the results being so far outside the expected margin of error, would not be accepted. Let's get a few things clarified. Voter fraud is when individual people vote illegally, fraudulently. It's easy to detect, and Wisconsin has adequate protections against it, even though the GOP is jumping up and down about it at present. The real danger is election fraud via electronic voting machines. Let's just call it vote rigging to make it a little more simple. Those behind the rigging of elections want the public to be confused about these two crimes. Vote rigging is a type of fraud that can actually change the outcome of elections, and probably has. There has been testimony to Congress about solicitation to fraudulently program machines, and people have gone to prison for altering the machine tabulated totals.
Another thing is very clear. People are willing to cheat to win important elections. In our winner-take-all system, there are always people who are ready to rig the vote. Elections are tremendously important and attract its share of liars and cheats attempting to rig the vote. Cheaters have figured out how to rig every election machine or system ever invented. Winning an election by vote rigging puts the cheaters behind the levers of power and allows them to further erode our democracy.
We cannot continue to let vote rigging continue in Wisconsin. Vote rigging occurred in the 1855 governor's election and then the 1996 Appleton mayoral election, and is suspected to have occurred in the 2011 Supreme Court election and the 2012 recall election of the governor. Wisconsin continues to be vulnerable to vote rigging, with two privately owned out-of-state companies with radical right-wing origins controlling the tabulation of 97% of the votes in Wisconsin. It is not hard to be suspicious of the results. One person at either company, or an individual able to penetrate the programming of either company, could easily flip enough votes to have altered the outcome of the recent elections for Supreme Court, U.S. Senate, Attorney General, and Governor. Laws and contractual restrictions have been put in place to prevent the actual counting of the votes and to prevent citizens from examining the programs of the machines. Wisconsin still doesn't seem adequately protected against these known threats. Can we count on the Government Accountability Board, the agency charged with overseeing the integrity of our elections, putting adequate protections in place to keep the vote from being rigged? No, it would be foolish to think that, although many in Wisconsin do. The GAB is actively discounting the possibility of vote rigging occurring in Wisconsin. They say it's not happening. The Democratic Party says the same thing, and the Republican Party is convinced there are folks out there just waiting to vote fraudulently. So how do we know the GAB is not protecting our vote? The GAB does not alert local election officials to the possible methods of election fraud via rigging the electronic voting machines, and therefore doesn't train them on how to prevent it. The pre-election tests of the machines are woefully inadequate. It doesn't examine the source code, which could be rigged to switch votes from one candidate to another, or hacked after the election before the votes are transmitted. The GAB is preventing the local election officials from counting the votes to compare the real totals of the machines to the machine totals. Thomas Jefferson said, "Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty." Are we as voters vigilant here in Wisconsin? If the voting machine programmers are from right-wing private companies, if no one can verify that the votes cast electronically or with optical scan machines hooked up to the internet are correct, and if we are using machines that are known to be unreliable, if the agency charged with protecting the integrity of the voting system is not vigorously protecting the vote, perhaps it is not unreasonable to assume that the vote has been and will be rigged. So what can you as a voter do? You can demand hand-counted, verifiable paper ballots used for every election. You can call your county board of canvassers and ask that in any jurisdiction using the DRE machines that paper ballots are available, enough paper ballots for anyone who requests one to vote. Get everyone you know to do the same. Refuse to vote on the electronic voting machines. Call or write the Government Accountability Board and ask that Wisconsin returns to voting on paper ballots that are hand-counted and verified. Ask the GAB to overturn its order that prevents verifying the results of each optical scan machine with a hand count. The Grassroots Network is organizing people to protect, to occupy our elections by becoming election protectors. Join Wisconsin Grassroots Network at wisconsingrassroots.net. We, the citizens of Wisconsin, have to stand up and protect our democracy from the cheaters who want to steal elections and destroy our way of life. You know that the realization that electronic voting machines are at risk to our democracy when even USA Today ran a column by Philip Meyer entitled, "Computers Could Steal This Election." It ends with this quote by Pamela Smith, the head of Verified Voting Foundation. "There is still time, but the hour grows late."